Thanks for listening to the Just Salvos podcast. Get connected with us through our website, justsalvos.com, and our various social media accounts. Search for Just Salvos. The aim of our podcast is to engage Salvos in meaningful and respectful discussion regarding controversial or hot topics. The views or comments of those participating in the podcast do not necessarily reflect the views of the Salvation Army. This podcast was recorded on the land for which the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation are the traditional owners and custodians. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging.
Welcome to Just Salvos' second podcast. It's good to have you listening. We can't believe that anyone has tuned in, and we're glad that you did, and we hope that we make it worth your while today. From time to time in the Salvation Army, we all know that issues pop up that get people a little bit hot under the collar. And it's not just us, of course. It happens in the wider church as well and in society. And almost out of nowhere, there is this vigorous debate that occurs because someone has expressed an opinion about something. It seems to have got worse for me, and I'm getting older, so I think with the invention of social media and the instancy of which people can respond, that it seems to have got worse in the sense that we are very quick to judge other people's opinions and to criticize them in a very public way. These days, people are well aware of the fact that there are different opinions to theirs, and we play out those differences in the public arena. I wonder if Salvationists ever all agreed on everything. I suspect not. I suspect that we never really had a common opinion on all topics, but it seems to me today that the arguments that arise are more prominent, sometimes a little bit more vicious, and there seems to be an attempt to simplify all arguments and place people on one side of a debate. And we very quickly organize people into good and bad based on where we think we sit on that side of debate. So in this podcast today, we wanted to talk about theological diversity within the Salvation Army and discuss how our differences in theological opinions might impact the existing Salvation Army now, but also the future Salvation Army as we move towards being one territory. Today, we're very privileged to have a group of people, I want to call them experts, but then they'll get cross, but a group of people that are able to articulate their opinion and have some education and some understanding and some practical understanding of how these things play out in day-to-day ministry. So with us today, we have Dean Smith. And I'm not going to call anyone by their rank or title, so, I'll just call your name, and if you want to tell us how special you are later, that would be great. We have Dean Smith. Dean is, I've always called him Dean, and he's still Dean because he is the Dean of Students and the Senior Lecturer in Theology and Philosophy, I like that, at Nazarene Theological College, which is one of the colleges linked with the Sydney College of Divinity. So welcome, Dean.
Thank you.
Yay. And we have Diane Hobbs. Diane's title is very long, but Diane and her husband Pete are in charge of the Greater Geelong Emerging Missional Communities. And so she is one of the Greater Geelong Emerging Missional Communities coordinators. Does that even fit on a business card?
Whatever that means.
But welcome,
yes,
Diane.
Thank you very much.
And we have Jason Davies-Kildea. I have a pet name for him, but I won't use that today because it's probably not appropriate. Jason is the manager of the Victoria Social Program and Policy Unit. Welcome, Jason.
Good to be here.
And we have Mal Davies, and Mal is a Corps officer at the South Barwon Corps, which sounds so simple.
It's nice and short, fits on my business card well.
Excellent. Thank you all for agreeing to come here today and put your life and yourselves on the line. It's funny, it's easy to have an opinion without a microphone, so we appreciate that you've come. You'd imagine that I've been called many things over the years. Some of my friends claim that I am far too liberal, and people within the church are often shocked at some of the opinions that they hear coming out of my mouth. If only they knew that by the time I had said those opinions, I've usually changed them. My unchurched friends, however, fear that I've become far too conservative, and that the longer I'm with the church, the more conservative my views seem to come. Recently, someone accused Just Salvos of having lost touch with sense of reason and of working for Satan, which I felt, even for me, was a little harsh. What theological labels have you had used about you or other people?
Certainly not working for Satan. You've done well to get that.
Still time.
I'm wondering what the pay rate's like, actually. My theology is very evangelical, so probably the one I get branded with most is fundamentalist. I guess for some people there's liberal as a small part of the wedge, and anything outside of that is fundamentalist, and I'm in that part.
Thank you.
I'm called a God botherer sometimes, and at the same time, like you on the other side, I'm a heretic, or I'm responsible for dragging the Salvation Army in some direction that's unclear. Those kind of things. I have been a person that people feel the need to warn others about because of my opinions.
We're not always so overt in our opinions, but we have actually been called Marxists, and that we are or will be the downfall of the Salvation Army. So, generally liberal. We're clumped into that camp.
William Booth was called a Marxist too, so you're in good company.
I know, that's right.
I find that one, it's just the last couple of years that people have come up with calling us Marxists.
Yeah,
so that's quite new. Okay.
We had some Red Shield collectors last weekend who were called communists.
Oh, excellent.
Left them befuddled. They didn't know how to respond.
So how about you, Dean? Where have people labelled you?
Look, heretic I think is probably one that I've had from time to time, usually by people that actually don't know me, but it's actually a lot of the discussions about this and labels often are sort of not from people that actually have spoken to you or talked, but they've heard it through the grapevine. And so therefore the label sticks. And
I think it would take a good deal of intellectual capacity to label some of you, because I've read some of your work and frankly, I'm not smart enough to understand it. So assigning a label to you based on what I've read would be quite difficult for me. But, other brighter people than me have probably done that. So I think what you're suggesting is that often we're labelled based on people's interpretation of our theology rather than people actually being aware of what we truly think. Would that be true for you all?
Or something that's captured. So even the idea that you've committed to a course of study around something, puts you in some kind of academic box, which allows you to be dismissed by some people.
And I think what Dean said about actually being labelled based on something potentially you might, like a question you might have asked, not necessarily you're asking it because that's actually fundamentally what you believe, but actually you're engaging with your community or your peers or even an article that you've read, and you're actually reflecting on that. And so you might question or engage in a conversation and then people then suddenly go, this is your assumed position. And so it's about how we can, take down some of those boundaries that actually where people try to put people into boxes and encourage that discussion.
Yeah, and I think part of the challenge perhaps is that once you're labelled, that label kind of sticks, doesn't it? So there's a sense in which you may have rethought things and yet, it's too late because we've already decided which camp you fit in. Is that true for other people?
Even if the label didn't fit in the first place. So as Dean said, sometimes it's by someone who doesn't know you or you never even hear how they came to that conclusion. There's no analysis or, the people who might have, referred to me as a heretic, they're not quoting anything that I've specifically said or argued why that opinion is heretical. They're just applying a label without any consideration. So you never get an opportunity to answer that or to be, genuinely hold yourself accountable to it.
I think theologically too, because there are so many levels, or it's like a gradient, isn't it? We're going to refer to that, I think, a bit later on. But sometimes we don't know all of those, so we put someone in the box that's closest to that.
Yeah.
I think years ago when I was involved at the War Cry and we'd get our CDs that would be sent in for review, there was a guy on staff, Richard Lewis, who's a very knowledgeable musician. Something would come in, I wouldn't even know what category of music it was. It's like alt country, pop, folk rock, something. And I'd go to Richard and I'd say, what sort of music is this? And he'd tell me the genre. I think we can do that theologically. Someone will express an opinion and I think, doesn't sound like me, therefore they must be liberal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
people often say to me, oh, why don't you write a book? Which I think is a very funny thing to ask me. But one of my greatest fears was always once you put something in print, then that opinion has to stay forever. But I've only come to realize, because I'm a bit slow, once you put something on the internet, it appears as though that opinion stays forever too. So I think with the introduction of the ability to keep anything I say forever and use it either for me or against me, it means that just a little snippet of an idea might become how someone labels me. Have you experienced that?
Yeah, and I think also it's about the interpretation of the labels that we receive, because I think sometimes we receive labels for people to actually place us as somewhere potentially separate from themselves. But also it's about how we interpret those labels too. So when I was called that Marxist, then I was like, well, what does that mean? And what are they trying to say? And is it actually, that's actually might be a good thing. Do you know what I mean? Like, depending on which viewpoint you come from. So it's also about how we assign those labels to ourselves too.
Yeah, I think you've touched on something there. Why do you think we feel it necessary to assign labels to one another, particularly when it comes to our theology?
It's how we identify people. I mean, in Australia, especially if you go to a party, a backyard barbecue or whatever, one of the first questions is, what do you do for a living? What do you do for a crust? And as soon as we know someone's a teacher or a plumber or a truck driver, we start to form our idea. Okay, this is the sort of person they are because they've just said the words, I'm an accountant. And we do that theologically. It helps us to place people in a sense. Oh, okay, so that's who you are. That's the sort of person you are. And we form this whole stereotype.
It's about tribal identity too. So we do it with football clubs. You know, are you for me or against me? Are you one of the band that are part of my team, or are you one of everyone else who is against that? It's the theological or social version of the same kind of thing.
I think we tend to think slip into thinking in binaries. So in a sense, a label is, you have to be either this or that. And I think in the West, we tend to think in binaries, and it's hard for us to think in terms of this and that. It's easier to say, oh, well, you're this and I'm, so we use labels to fit into a kind of a binary way of thinking. And I think that's what probably causes some problems.
Why do you think it gets so nasty? Why do you think in labelling people, if it's just about categorising people to understand and work out where we fit into the scheme of things, why do you think, and increasingly it seems to me, that it gets nasty? What's that about?
I think, I just think it's sometimes generated out of a place of fear or a place where they're not necessarily informed of your own perspective. It's that lack of dialogue sometimes that comes where quick assumptions are made and quick projections are made, and then it's determined on your own personal response to that. And sometimes that's driven by natural responses like fight or flight. If we view this person as potentially a threat to us, then in that sense we want to sometimes become close-fisted. We want to become, oppositional. Rather than actually trying to slow those natural responses down, to actually have eyes to see and ears to hear potentially what that other person is saying. And that, what was said before about that, the binary places we put ourselves in, often actually within that dialogue we actually find that there's more places of, where we agree with each other rather than disagree. And it's actually in that dialogue and that respectful relationships and actually slowing some of those natural responses and quick assumptions that we can actually formulate potentially better opinions, or not better opinions, but perhaps more informed opinions.
Yep.
I agree. It's that moment where you transcend the label kind of in relationships. So the thing that really heightens this kind of discussion, or where it's kind of adversarial, it's me against you, that's only allowed by the kind of thinness, the narrowness of the relationship, which is at a distance or which doesn't exist at all. But actually when you engage each other as human beings and you can see beyond those labels to the reality, which is more complex, it's much harder to hold those labels up, and it's harder to hold those labels up in opposition against one another too.
Most people fear anything that's different. I sometimes fear anything that's new. So if someone's brought up through their life, through in the church, through Sunday school and so on, and they're taught X equals X and this is what it is, and suddenly you get to a point where you're 25, 30, whatever it might be, and someone says, no, actually, I think X equals Y, they might be right, but it throws you for a loop because your understanding is X equals X. And that happens theologically, where there's something I've always believed, and that's what it is. Someone else says something different, and suddenly it throws my head in, oh, maybe I've had it wrong all along.
Yeah,
so I sort of fear anything that's different.
So what's really at stake here then? It's not just about knowing who's in what camp. What's really going on here, do you think?
I think sometimes, going back to what you're saying about relationship, I think sometimes the 30-second soundbite, which is really what our society is now used to, a 30-second soundbite, if you can't get it across in that time. Whereas to actually express views properly, theologically, you probably need some time, and you need to nuance your views. It's not just simply black and white. It's often a nuanced view, but nobody has that time to engage in that sort of way. And so often it comes back to the idea of the label is put on somebody from a 30-second conversation or a 30-second soundbite, whereas really I think it comes to relationship. I think the ability to be able to sit and hear the view, which is often takes, the old idea of sitting around and having an hour or a couple of hour conversation and understanding where we can ask our questions to get clarification, they can respond. But of course, these days it's all happens very quickly. And so it's much easier in the current climate where everything's a 30-second soundbite to draw wrong opinions or false opinions based on something that someone said.
Yeah. I think this is what I really like about this concept too for these podcasts, is that we can actually draw people from very different theological perspectives, draw them together and have kind of an informed, educated, dialogue, and still be at the end of it on the same page, moving in the same direction, even though we are quite diverse in our exposure to the world, our cultural, our sociological, political backgrounds. They will inform the choices that we make now and our interpretation of theology. But ultimately, even with that in mind, we can still move our ship forward, together.
Yeah. And I think probably there needs to be some real compassion for people who feel threatened by strong theological opinions, because the reality is there is a lot at stake, isn't there? And I think that we often underestimate that we're actually asking people to challenge the things that they've based their life, their whole world on. And so by not having adequate conversations, as Dean was saying, that we based on very limited information, we're actually asking people to have a big shift in their thinking, which undermines sometimes their very identity and sense of purpose. So I think being able to acknowledge that is a real help as we go forward for people. What do you think about that?
I mean, we sit right in the centre of that tradition. Let me be the first to bring the Bible into the discussion.
Excellent.
But, we
we
worship Jesus, who was crucified by the authorities of his day because he represented a threat to power. And this is absolutely what some of that is about. So I think sometimes, the discussion might dismiss the idea of theology as something that's going on in your head or some kind of minor, kind of marginal thing. But as you say, it's actually very strongly part of our identity and who we are. We don't want that challenged. But often it is going to be these days. We live in a world in which Christian influence is declining really significantly. And we've had the better side of that for a very long time. And so this sense of kind of losing social privilege, losing power in society, losing power and control even within our own churches is incredibly threatening to people. But it's exactly those kind of power struggles that is at the centre of our faith, at the centre of the crucified Christ.
Yeah. I often think about it that when I challenge one theological opinion on something, it's like I'm removing a brick from a wall for people, and that they feel as though the whole structure will fall down if we do that. Is that your experience?
Certainly, as a teacher of first-year theology students for 15 years or more, every year there is the same process of the students coming across new ideas for the first time, there is that sense of the ground's about to go from beneath me if I give this up. And so there is, and it's because, I think it was said before, it's because our beliefs are so important to us. It's so tied up with who we are, so tied up so that when we start to question those, then it can feel as if I'm losing control of my identity, I'm losing control. And so there is that sense of the rug's being pulled out from under me. And if I allow it, if I go so far, then what is too far? And so there becomes a concern about that, I think. So, yes, I think that becomes an issue for people.
Yeah. And maybe leaves people questioning their whole life choices about why they are doing what they do and so on. That's my experience. I remember a conversation with someone that said, if I didn't believe that, then I don't know how I would work out everything else that I've done with my life. It would seem as though I've wasted my life. And I realised then what was at stake for people.
And I think Dean's spot on. And speaking from someone from an evangelical background, my parents, my grandparents and so on, and certainly me, are very evangelical theology. One of the cornerstones of how we believe and how I believe is about conviction. It's about being convinced. It's about solid rocks that our faith is built on and so on. So in some ways, I've almost been envious of those who are more liberal in their thinking because of the quicker ability to change or to say, yeah, hang on, actually that's a better argument. Now I'm going to believe this. For someone like me, it's like there's these solid foundations. This is what I believe. This is what my parents believed. It worked for them. It works for me now, and so on. To pull out one of those bricks for someone who's of my theological tradition can be shattering. Now, I remember, when I was at college, and Dean, spot on, when I was at college in our first year, there were people around me almost in tears during lectures because suddenly things that they'd believed forever were being told, well, that's probably not quite right, or that's not what it meant, or that's not what he said, and so on. So, yes, it is a challenge, but I'd argue maybe even more of a challenge for someone from an evangelical background.
Yeah, I think you're right. I come from basically an unchurched background, and I'm the sort of person that can adopt new ideas quite early. And so for me, the key thing is to stop and realise how much is at stake for other people. Because for me, partly it's an intellectual exercise, partly it's just very pragmatic that my theological opinions need to change in practice. And then I see the look on people's faces and I realise I have, gone in with boots again where I should have tiptoed quietly. So it is a really difficult, challenging space. What about within our own denomination particularly, there seems to be such a variety of theological opinions. Why do you think that is? How did that come about?
I think that's always the case. I think there were differences between William and Catherine Booth at the very beginning. In fact, I think there were differences between William Booth earlier and William Booth later William Booth later again, So
he changed his mind.
That kind of diversity is absolutely part of our movement from the very beginning, just as it was part of the Methodist movement before that. And, you trace that kind of right back through history. I mean, again, here I am banging on about the Bible, but one of the beautiful things about the richness of the Bible is the diversity that's represented within it. Sometimes we're kind of strained to look for kind of, the unity, the thread through that. But for me, part of the richness and the wealth of what the material in the Scripture is about the way that it represents different views and doesn't always feel the need to resolve them, is able to have them living, kind of alongside each other as different perspectives that relate to different times, different cultures, that match that particular moment for that person.
Yeah.
Well, even Paul had you see that change in his theology too, that changes over time with the passing of Jesus or the resurrection of Jesus. And I think it's really important that we do grapple that even and overcoming that vulnerability that we're talking about with theology of asking those questions and hiding away from asking the questions of what if this means that I'm going to lose my faith, and actually encouraging each of us to actually really wrestle as a sign of health that actually where am I sitting with this theology at the moment. And that's one of the things I think I really love about William and Catherine is the birth of the Salvation Army came out of that wrestle, that of what they were observing and how that was reflected in what they knew and understood as scriptures versus what was being played out within the church at that time, within the community. It moved him to be asking and fighting for those questions. Well, what's happening? Why are we doing what we're doing? what's going on here that we're not addressing, and that fundamentally was the foundation of the Salvation Army.
Do you think for a time we may have been so busy doing the business of being the Salvation Army and doing what we believe our part in God's mission is, that perhaps we didn't ask the deep questions of theology in the same way that's being asked now? I get the sense that there might have been a period of time, I'm sure the conversations always happened, but that there's more questioning now. Do you think that's true?
Sociologically, I think every movement starts off usually with a fairly strong shared agenda of things, and that includes beliefs. So I think when the Salvation Army began, it had a fairly strongly shared set of views, just like the Reformation, the period of the Reformation. People, the reformers, all for at least for the first probably dozen or so years, agreed on justification by faith, and they all shared that similar view, and that's what gave their identity. But I think as time goes on, as each generation comes, any movement is going to start to reflect the broader community of which it's a part, and so a lot of those shared ideas then are not quite so shared. I just think it's part of the natural progression of any movement, of any group, that and often people will see that as a sort of a negative thing. They'll see that as, oh, we've lost the vision that we've had. But in fact, just like the early church sort of started, probably would have been always diverse, but there was a much more strongly shared views that over time didn't take long before they started arguing about what does it mean to be a Christian. Some say it's to go out to the desert, others stay in and do this. So it doesn't take long, and so I think it's just a part of the natural progression, and I think we imagine that that we should return to some sort of utopian time when we all sort of sung Kumbaya, and sort of all had an agreement about everything, which I don't think ever was the case. But I think as an organisation or a movement develops and grows, it becomes less and less that way because our children start to disagree with us. The next generation starts to think differently.
Do you think that it comes back to that vulnerability too of then expressing those views, that if for some we're almost in a rut, as in we just are so happy doing what we've been doing, that actually there have been people that have gone before us who have asked questions and then have kind of been isolated or alienated or have moved away, that there has been a reluctance for people to actually raise questions or express some form of diversity because of the implications of potentially to themselves and their families and, the Salvation Army, really.
Yeah, and I think there's a reality that yesterday's heretic is today's conservative. I think that's normal, isn't it? I suspect, too, there's been unprecedented change sociologically in the world in the last however many years. And so actually articulating our theology for the world that exists now is also a challenge, and we have to think about things that perhaps people didn't have to think about. And so we're looking at what does God say and where is God in situations that didn't appear to exist or didn't exist 50 years ago. Do you think that affects it too?
I think it's an interesting position in that while and this gets down to, I think, one of the crux differences between liberal theology and evangelical theology, that is that while there are changes in culture and changes in society and yes, sociological changes, do the foundational doctrines stay the same? Jesus still died and was resurrected, and what happened, and so on. And as I said, it gets to the core of the matter in terms of when do we start to say Christian doctrines need updating? Now, I'm of the theological tradition that say they don't. They're the ones that have stood for the last however many centuries still work. They're pretty good, whereas others would say, but they don't keep up with society or culture. I say they don't have to. They're timeless. So I think you're right at the heart of it. So, yes, there are changes sociologically. Does that mean straight biblical and Christian doctrine should change?
Yeah, I mean, how is it that we all read the same Bible and we come up with different theological ideas and opinions?
It's partly because it's a great book and so
read.
much depth in it.
I think also that the world has changed, obviously, so much since Jesus, since the Old Testament, but actually human nature really hasn't, in the sense that you look around, there's still fractured families, there's still poverty, there are still those same issues that Jesus fought for to raise awareness of. And so some things have changed, yeah, definitely a lot. I mean, obviously it's quite different. But the person down the street right now is just worried about, where is God in my life right now? I can't feed my family, our family's fractured, parents are holding knives to their children's throat. They're wanting to know actually, where is God in this? And some things haven't really changed. So we can hold fast to our traditions because, obviously we are looking at quite a different picture than what our parents and our former generations did. But actually, some of those same issues that they experience, we are today still.
I take a pretty pragmatic view of some of this stuff. So, you can measure a whole bunch of ways in which society's changed, particularly in the last 50 to 60 years. And whether or not you agree with some of those changes, they've occurred and they've changed the kinds of conversations that people in the church have with people outside of the church. And over that period, the church, certainly in Australia, has been declining really consistently. There's no doubt about that. So we've been unsuccessful in our evangelical methods. Whether that's been a successful strategy or not isn't in doubt. The evidence is kind of overwhelming that it's not been a successful strategy. Now, does that mean we throw it all out and start again and try and base something on only sociological data? No, I don't think it does. But I do think that we need to have a more rigorous, robust kind of conversation about what it means to engage with 21st century people and understand the starting point from their point of view, not only from our tradition's point of view.
And perhaps, too, to analyse what are our non-negotiables. And it surprises me how many times when I say to people, well, what are your non-negotiables? That there hasn't been a great deal of thought put into settling on what those things are, because I suspect if we did have that conversation, we'd probably find we have a lot more in common than we realise. But there's this perhaps a perception about what our beliefs are, and so we tend to put everyone on a continuum. You're either liberal or you're fundamentalist, or we might use nice words like conservative and progressive and things like that, somewhere in the middle. But we seem to want to pigeonhole people and put them somewhere on a line and work out what we have that's different from them. Do you think that it is possible for us to be united in our mission, even if we have different theological opinions? And I'm not asking Dean to answer this yet, because I'm going to ask him a little bit different question in a minute. But for the others, do you think it is possible for us to be united in our mission and yet have different theological opinions?
Yeah, no doubt. Of course it is. And I go back to what Jason was saying earlier about the football team, that sort of thing. I'm sure I can barrack for my football team, but I can allow others to barrack for their football team.
That would be Geelong, where you live now, wouldn't it?
God bless Geelong football team.
Just checking.
But the fact is, at the end of the day, we all love football.
Yes.
We all enjoy watching a good football match. So I think, yes, there is certainly room in the Salvation Army. And look, part of it comes back to maybe body of Christ stuff too, that we need that part, and we need that part. I've said to my congregation before, imagine if the whole church was just like you. If everyone in our church was just like you, there would be some things that our church would do fantastically and brilliantly, and there'd be some things that would be forgotten and never bothered with. I think it applies for the Salvation Army too. Imagine if the whole Salvation Army, every member, everyone who attended was of an evangelical theological tradition. There'd be some almighty strengths, but some glaring weaknesses. Imagine if everyone was extremely liberal in their theology. Again, some wonderful strengths, but probably some gaps, some glaring weaknesses. So, yes, we need all sorts.
I collected in the Red Shield Appeal with a group of Sikhs who have some very different theological beliefs to me, but we gathered together on that same day to join in the mission of God to kind of, help the work of the Salvation Army. If I can get together with people from a fundamentally, quite diverse theological tradition than my own to do that kind of work, why couldn't I do it together with fellow Salvationists? That's what it comes down to for me.
And I think for me, my immediate response to that was yes, because I actually see diversity as a really great thing. It's healthy. It's good to ask questions. It's good to meet with people that are from different perspectives to you and see the world in different ways, even from different religious backgrounds. So I see that as yes. I think the struggle is when sometimes we do try to bring down those that we see as opposite to us, and sometimes in this language, in this, rather than actually seeing it from a positive perspective and actually going, this is actually healthy that you hold this different opinion to me. In fact, I'm going to target you and people like you and really label you. I think that can be really unhealthy, and I think that there's potentially a lot of really great leaders that we have lost from the Salvation Army because they've been either marginalised, labelled, rejected, thrown out, and actually they're still wonderful ambassadors for Jesus, but now not in the Salvation Army anymore. And I think that's actually really it's detrimental. It's really sad, actually, that we can't, within our own diversity, just encourage each other to respectfully play out what are we wrestling with and what's at stake here.
I used to think that I just occupied my own little space in the continuum, which changed from day to day and which other people had often assigned me to, and that perhaps we should all just settle for that, and maybe if we showed a little bit more tolerance, we would be able to get along and work on the mission. But then I read Dean Smith's work, and so I'm glad that Dean's with us today. Dean, you actually suggest that rather than just occupying our space on a continuum or a spectrum, that the divisions that split us are actually best understood when we look at them from, and he'll explain this, I'm sure, as incommensurable paradigms or traditions. Could you explain this for us, please?
I'll be happy to, but first up I need to say that this is a theory that you can reject if you like.
We may already have done so.
You may have already done so, and that's fine. It's really building on a theory that was put forward by Thomas Kuhn, who is a philosopher of science. And what he was trying to do is explain the way science works or how science develops through the ages. The typical view of science is that it's like a bucket theory, that science, in its uncovering of how the way the world works and how things happening, it's kind of filling the bucket with truth. And basically the idea being that eventually one day the bucket will be full and science will have uncovered reality. Basically, it will know all the truth to be had. Kuhn disagreed with that idea, and he basically said that no, that's not how it happens at all. What happens is that science works within paradigms, that is sort of a worldview, and that it works and it progresses within that worldview until problems start not being solved. Science fails in its basic understanding of the way things work and the way the world works. And young scientists then begin to, there comes a sort of an epistemological crisis where the world no longer starts to make sense. And then young scientists have the creative energy to start thinking about another possible explanation for everything. And then what happens is, in a period of time, eventually there's a paradigm shift. And so, for instance, moving from a Newtonian paradigm to an Einsteinian view is not just simply small adjustments to the way the world works, but a completely different way, because Newtonian science relies on determinism, strong determinism, whereas in the Einsteinian paradigm there's indeterminism and there's possibilities of things not being following that. And so I take that up then and basically say that I think really that's this for me is the best explanation for me of understanding. People may not agree with me, but for me it's really come to see theology in the same way that Kuhn saw science, so that in some ways that at particular periods of time, liberal theology or progressive theology, as it's often referred to these days, actually represents a different worldview. It's a different way of understanding reality that takes reason and experience as the founding ways, and that's the authority for that particular paradigm. Evangelical, conservative, ultra-conservative fit within a traditional understanding where the authority is the Bible and tradition. And so these different views. So I guess in a sort of a fairly short way, that for me has been a way of explaining how is it that, for instance, churches can become so for instance, in the Uniting Church, the United Theological, what's the church? The Uniting Church in America anyway. They're basically getting to a point where they will probably split over the homosexual, the gay question. And I think really when it comes down to it, when you actually look at why is it that there is such disagreement, I think it comes down to what is the authority. And for the conservative evangelicals, it is the authority of Scripture, and that's the arguments that you will read are all based in biblical texts. Yep. On the other hand, the liberal or progressive side will be talking about things like genetics and science, and their basis of authority will be built more upon the science, upon reason. And these views simply, people end up talking past each other. They're not actually discussing on equal terms. They're sort of starting off from a different place, and it's not surprising that they end up in a different place.
So what do you think of that theory, people?
I think it's absolutely got some truth to it, particularly kind of when you look at people in groups, because that group nature of trying to all share a common belief and be part of the community by that, attracts that. I think it breaks down on an individual level. So you might have someone who is theologically conservative but socially progressive, for instance. Or so if you look at a single dimension of what people believe, you could split creationism against, evolution or something like that. And I think that kind of theory works. They become absolutely irreconcilable. But I suspect that's part of this thing that we began with in talking about this kind of otherness and prejudice against people who we label is only allowed by kind of a really shallow interaction between people. And the deeper you kind of go past that, the more you're able to genuinely kind of transcend some of those limitations that the buckets even make no more sense, whether they're separate or together. In fact, we're all sorts of complex, human beings that are evolving our ideas and our practice all the time.
Yeah. I think for me, reading your theories, Dean, it helped me understand why the more articulate argument wasn't the answer, or greater patience in helping people to see things from my perspective wasn't the answer. That actually we were at two very different starting points. And so, as you said, we were talking past each other, and I've felt that a lot in my conversations. We're not even talking about the same thing. And so it becomes too easy, too convenient perhaps to just lump people in one of the buckets rather than to try and tease out where those ideas came from and what is the paradigm that they're operating from, and how then we can perhaps have common goals and walk alongside each other.
Yeah, and the implications that those outcomes of those discussions or decisions have on the greater community, not just the church body, but the greater community as well. And I think potentially it's been in those sometimes destructive conversations where we haven't really, we've put forward our own perspectives and gathered our little troops together to kind of reinforce our own perspectives without really listening well to the other perspectives, that people who are observing and listening to our dialogue have actually disengaged now because it's been destructive rather than helpful.
When I was at uni 1 or 2 years ago, many years ago, I remember one of my philosophy lecturers talking about what he referred to as ice cream arguments, and he'd say, you like chocolate ice cream, someone else likes strawberry ice cream. There's no real argument there. They're allowed to like strawberry ice cream. You're allowed to like chocolate ice cream. You're quite different and so on. I think theologically what we try to do is to win people over. You must love chocolate ice cream, or no, you must love strawberry ice cream, rather than saying, look, I like chocolate ice cream. You like strawberry ice cream. We both like ice cream. Let's just move on. And that's that's where I think the paradigm that Dean's talked about sort of works, that there is this spread of beliefs as such along the line, and it's not just this camp or this camp, and you must be in one of those camps. And getting back to what Jason said earlier about the tribal thing, the energy then is put into dragging people into my tribe. You must be in my tribe. It could be an ice cream argument. It could be, I like chocolate, you like strawberry.
Yeah, it could be, except there's a lot more at stake, isn't there? Because you can always decide not to eat ice cream. But what we're discovering within these sort of debates is that they do damage to those that are already followers of Jesus, but then the damage that it does for those who we claim to exist for is very great. And I certainly know within my own family, I still come from a largely unchurched family. And because we cannot agree or disagree nicely, they actually decide that the whole church and all of theology is not worth listening to. So I guess I agree with you that intellectually we can say that, but the outworking of that for me and for those that I love and for the world that I care for is very, very different. What do you think about that?
I agree. And I think actually the online debates that have been generated are really destructive, and I've actually pulled down many of, I just don't engage in that forum because I just immediately come from the perspective of, I think, guardianship for my community, like the greater people that we're actually every day just trying to love and to bring into a faith understanding of, and these, as being observers of these discussions, are actually never helpful for them. It actually raises more questions and potentially sets them back on their journey. And I just think it's difficult. I think, and it's not necessarily about the questions that we raise, and because I really think that we need to be having these debates and theological debates and increasing our expressions of diversity and encouraging us in our different diversities. But I think it's the forum in which we do that so that we can, I think, some safeguard in a sense and protect some of the people that we're actually supposed to be shepherding and therefore,
Yeah, I think the pastoral imperative is actually really quite vital, and an understanding of Fowler's stages of faith and the way that people develop through those stages of faith, being aware as pastors that in fact that people who are moving from stage 4 to stage 5, where they move from a fairly solid understanding to where they start to critique and question, and where they're in a place where they're trying to make sense of their faith, then we need to be beside them and to help them to move through that. Now, sometimes in the Salvation Army, we haven't been very good at being able to make a safe space for people to ask those difficult questions, and we've perhaps even pushed them out because it's a bit too awkward for us. And sometimes that's because we don't know we haven't got our own answers to be able to help them. But and also being aware of the fact that not everybody's going to be at that stage, and that we need to be sensitive to people. So it's the pastoral imperative, I think, is very important when it comes to a whole lot of these questions, is to know, to have some understanding of where people are at in their journey, and to be able to provide them or to help give them a space wherever they happen to be. And if that means they're in a place where the world's not making any sense to them, to come alongside and help them through that journey. And I think if that being pastorally sensitive, I think not just simply wanting to shock and awe, just to sort of give radical views just to sort of stir people up or whatever, doesn't help.
Although it does sound a little bit like the bucket theory there, that they're moving on through a journey and eventually they'll have enough knowledge to form the right theological opinion, and whichever side I start from will clearly be the right theological opinion. So it's very complicated, isn't it? Holding a specific theological opinion does not necessarily mean that I'm immature in the faith or that I'm mature in the faith, but that I have come at it from a different angle perhaps. I'd like to think that it is possible that I can be conservative theologically but still inclusive, for instance, or that I can be liberal theologically but still believe in miracles and still hold Scripture as a primary source for my decision-making. Is that possible? Can we do that?
I'd say that would be the hope.
Be the hope?
Yeah, I think we've got to remember that this whole kind of perceived divide between fundamentalists and liberals or whatever, like that's 100 years old. It's relatively new. The Salvation Army existed before that, and if we're going to exist after that, we'll have to find a way of transcending that. One of our national mission values now is diversity, and I think that's going to be one of the hardest ones for us to embrace because we are literally concerned with uniformity in a whole bunch of ways. We like things to look and feel the same and consistent, but there's a whole bunch of reasons for which not only is that not helpful, but we found it excludes people, and Jesus was after the opposite, actually. He wanted to draw people in rather than push them out.
And collaboration is one of those as well.
Absolutely.
Within our mission values as well. And I think that's vital for the health of the Salvation Army and where we're moving is that we actually continue to collaborate with those of differing opinions because it's actually in that unpacking, as we said, that it's either strengthens our argument or potentially, we might come at it from a different perspective because we've actually enabled ourselves to unpack what we've always believed to be true. And as I said, there is a fear and a vulnerability in that, but there's also, great opportunity and a freedom in potentially being in a healthier position if we allow ourselves to do that.
I was just going to say another person who uses that same term, incommensurability, is a fellow by the name of Alistair McIntyre, and he argues that you can only actually understand an incommensurable position from within that position. And so the idea there is that you take the anthropological approach, that is, rather than talking and sort of putting across your views, the anthropologist goes into a culture and they seek to understand the views from within inside that before they actually start speaking. And so it can be tempting to sort of be wanting to speak and to put forward our views, but actually if we're seeking to understand, we need to, be listening to exactly giving time to what people are saying, which takes relationship, which takes building of relationship, hearing what they're saying, seeking to understand them. And I think that can't be a bad thing, listening more, speaking less, hearing what people have got to say. And only then, once we have a fair understanding and we've built a relationship, and then that's the time you can start to enter into dialogue rather than sort of the Facebook thing where basically that doesn't, you don't start from that. You're sort of basically into it, hammer and tongs straight away. And
I love that idea of it being a cross-cultural conversation and actually that we enter into it as learners and that we might come away enriched. I think that's a wonderful idea.
And really that we've all have come to our own theological perspectives from very different and diverse backgrounds. And we only, and often very privileged backgrounds. So that sense of actually learning is so, I think, vital, really, because an understanding that we actually don't have all the answers. We don't have all the answers.
I'm horrified by that.
And that diversity has existed since the beginning. So that's actually not the ultimatum because, God is very diverse. If you just look around creation, we expect that that's unity and diversity, but is that really we can expect those things, but if we're actually really looking at the very nature of God, He's extremely diverse.
Yeah, I think you're right. Do you think there are specific actions or attitudes that we can adopt that will help us to unite in common purpose within the Salvation Army? Or do you think it's inevitable that somewhere along the line, people that hold a particular theological opinion will have to drop off the edges of the organisation? It's a big question.
Sounds drastic, doesn't it? Drop off the edges.
And yet that seems to be that's what's at stake in many of our denominations around the world. So
I think it's been really interesting the last 6 months or so, however long it's been going on with the new vision statement and values and mission and everything that comes behind it, because that can serve to be very polarising in terms of I either agree with it or I don't agree with it. And is there that same paradigm? Is there that grey area of I agree with a bit of it and not this and so on? I think one of the more telling marks for our territory over that period has been the possibly deliberate moving aside of the international positional statement of the Salvation Army, or the international mission statement rather, where it says we are an evangelical part of the universal Christian church. It's interesting that on our website at the moment, the Territories website, you will not find the international mission statement for the Salvation Army. You'll find our new values, you'll find our new vision, you'll find our new and so on. Every other Army website I've seen, including the Eastern Territories website, has the international mission statement, not the Southern Territories. So I don't know if that's been a deliberate thing to move away from that and that clear statement that the Salvation Army is an evangelical part of the Universal Christian Church, to say, actually, let's hide that a bit and talk about our new values and talk about our new mission. That scares me a little.
Yeah, I can understand that. And I think that would be a really interesting conversation to unpack, but unfortunately we don't have time now. But it reminds us again, there's a lot at stake, doesn't it? It reminds us again that the reason there's so much heat behind these conversations is it's not just a matter of your opinion. It's not just a matter of ice cream, is it? It's actually about my values and my life, my sense of purpose, my honouring God, my following Jesus, about actually living up to the calling and sense of identity that we have in Christ. And I think that the conversation today has been interesting and helpful. We've all been able to sit around the table and be nice to each other. But of course, we've only scratched the surface. We haven't faced situations on the ground that are affecting real people in real time. And that's, of course, when it gets hard. I want to thank you all for coming in today. I'm going to age myself here and tell you that my favourite TV show at the moment is called The Midwife. And I think that for me, they wrestle with some of these ideas incredibly well. So you see these nuns who are clearly very conservative, but they're dealing with a world that was changing significantly in the late 1950s, the early 1960s. And you watch them wrestle with, what does it mean to be faithful? What does it mean to honour God with my life in a changing world? And I see them meet people with grace. I see them meet people with compassion. So that pastoral imperative seems to allow them to enter into spaces and allow their theology to impact the decisions, but not to ever prevent them from showing love. And I hope that going forward that's what we can do, that we can continue the conversation. And I thank you all for modelling what it means to be able to have a conversation with people that we may or may not agree with, but be respectful. I hope that we can do that again. And thank you very much for coming in. Is there any last words that you want to say? Did you have a burning thing?
Maybe. I don't want to be the last person to speak. But I would really, really be saddened to see that our diversity would affect in a negative way our mission. And that's ultimately to see people come into a relationship with Jesus. And I think that ultimately that has to be our driving force, that even though we may differ in our opinions, our creativity, I think, should be encouraged, because we're at a point in Australia, in the whole world, where, you know, people aren't engaging in the Christian faith but are desperately in need of it. So I think how we do that, engage people creatively in their space, growing faith wherever life happens, I think we need to be encouraged, and I'd really hate it if our diversity really negatively affects our mission.
Yep. Anyone else?
Just to avoid Di having to have the last word.
Yeah, that's good.
and speaking clearly from an evangelical paradigm, my only concern with diversity and variation of theological views and so on is at some stage it goes so far that it becomes heresy, that at some point there's got to be a crossover point where actually what someone believes is just wrong. It's wrong for a liberal and it's wrong for an evangelical. It's wrong for anyone in that paradigm. That's just wrong. And so I think we need to be careful how diverse we can become, because you can get so diverse that suddenly what you're talking about, that's not actually Christian. And that person needs to be appropriately and lovingly and gracefully brought back into line as such, or introduced maybe to a greater truth, however you want to phrase it. But as I said, that diversity will get to a point where now it's so far away from Christ that it's actually not Christian.
Yep, and that can happen on either side of the argument, can't it? Yeah. Jason, Dean, anything you'd like to say as we finish?
I think you touched on something earlier, Sandy, which was that I think the better starting place is to concentrate on the areas that we can agree on rather than starting at the beginning about what we can't agree on. So, you know, that pragmatic thing of, well, you know, was I Jesus to this person? You know, can I align my behaviours and the way I spoke about things in the nature of the way that I understand Jesus. For me, that's a pretty good point to start to agree on. And if we can agree on that, then there's a whole lot of things that I'm happy not to agree on.
Well said. I'm in agreement with that.
Hear, hear. Thank you. It's been lovely.
Thanks for listening in. Today's discussion was guided by faith-based facilitation. For more information, head over to salvationarmy.org/FBF/resources.